In February 2026, the Strait of Hormuz closed. Within days, 95% of the tanker traffic moving through this narrow corridor stopped dead. The immediate market reaction made complete sense. Crude oil, heating oil, and gasoline prices spiked by as much as 50% as traders panicked over the disruption to energy supplies. But while the financial press focused heavily on the cost of driving and heating homes, a much more dangerous economic shock was brewing. The most consequential price spike hit the cost of feeding the world. Modern agriculture relies on a highly concentrated supply chain. When a single maritime choke point breaks down, the global food system discovers exactly how little slack it actually has. To understand why an oil shock triggers a food emergency, you have to look at how we grow crops. Modern nitrogen fertilizers, specifically ammonia and urea, are synthesized directly from natural gas. We essentially turn fossil fuels into food. The Persian Gulf is the beating heart of this chemical process. The Strait of Hormuz handles 30% of all globally traded fertilizers, along with 20% of the liquefied natural gas required to manufacture them elsewhere. This chart tracks the global fertilizer market's reaction. After the early March strikes, input costs went vertical. Middle East granular urea climbed 19% in days, hitting $590 per ton. U.S. Gulf DAP mirrored that exact upward trajectory. When this specific corridor shuts down, the foundational ingredient for modern farming is either cut off entirely or priced completely out of reach. At the farm level, the math becomes brutal very quickly. Since 2020, fertilizer has accounted for roughly 33 to 45% of the total operating costs to grow staple crops like corn and wheat. Growers are caught in a vicious margin compression. With input prices jumping 50% in a few weeks, they face an impossible choice: either buy less fertilizer, which guarantees lower crop yields, or take on crippling debt and risk bankruptcy. High oil prices create a secondary trap. They make ethanol production highly profitable, which incentivizes farmers to sell whatever corn and soy they do grow to biofuel refineries instead of the food market, tightening global grain supplies even further. Eventually, these elevated cultivation costs have to go somewhere. If they are passed down the supply chain, retail food prices skyrocket for consumers across the globe. Farm-level financial stress operates as the earliest warning siren. Long before shoppers notice a higher grocery bill, the agricultural sector is already signaling a massive wave of global consumer food inflation. To stop that inflation from reaching the consumer, governments step in to absorb the shock. They deploy emergency interventions, temporary fertilizer subsidies, priority freight handling at ports, and pooled procurement strategies to secure whatever supply is left. India presents the clearest case study of this mechanism. As the world's second-largest fertilizer consumer, it imports nearly 40 million tons of urea annually, relying heavily on the Gulf. That makes the country extraordinarily exposed to the Hormuz closure. To shield its farmers, India's fertilizer subsidy bill is projected to overshoot its original budget by roughly 70,000 crore rupees. That pushes the government's total subsidy outlay to an estimated 2.4 lakh crore for the fiscal year. This is a deliberate macroeconomic trade-off. The state absorbs the massive price shock, keeping the cost of fertilizer artificially flat for farmers to ensure the nation produces enough food for its population. In major agricultural economies, global food affordability is currently being bought on credit. Governments willingly trade their long-term fiscal health to maintain short-term agricultural stability. But not every country has the treasury to execute that kind of intervention. Developing nations across Africa and South Asia cannot afford to subsidize a global price shock of this magnitude. These economies are caught in a dual trap. They are hit with severe agricultural input inflation, and at the exact same time, they lose vital remittance incomes sent home by millions of migrant workers stranded in the halted Gulf economies. Without a government shield, retail-level food inflation hits the streets immediately. In heavily impacted regional markets like Iran, the cost of basic staples climbs hundreds of % in a matter of weeks, crippling household purchasing power. For import-dependent economies without the fiscal space to protect their farmers, a distant energy disruption translates directly and violently into a localized hunger crisis. There is, however, an unexpected vulnerability at the epicenter of this crisis. The wealthy Gulf nations, blockaded by the conflict, are themselves exceptionally exposed. This chart breaks down food supply origins for the Gulf states. Notice the massive red blocks representing imported food for nations like Bahrain and Qatar. Because of their arid climates, they import nearly 90% of their staple foods. They maintain strategic reserves, but once those buffers run out, the same maritime blockade causing the energy crisis threatens to starve the Gulf. It exposes a fragile design in the modern world order. Until the global economy diversifies how it produces fertilizer and where it sources its energy, human food security remains held hostage by a single, narrow shipping lane.